Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this latest teaching session in the course on technology and the future of medicine. Today we have student presentation from Hilary Lemay. The Hunger Games as a critique of modern society and the wealth discrepancy. Take it away, Hilary. Thanks.
Okay, so initially I was going to start without you guys knowing the topic. However, I'm just going to ask you guys, how many of you have seen the Hunger Games first off? Awesome. And what was your initial impression, or like what did you get out of it? Sort of lasting effects.
To be frank, my impression was, wow, this society is totally messed up. There's this authoritarian government controlling everyone. People have no rights, and the only hope that they can get is watching people sort of kill themselves and watching one sole survivor come out. So that's what I was most surprised about.
Mm-hmm.
Like the first movie or book, or like the whole series?
Of either or.
Okay, well, in the first book, I was just thinking about it's like Battle Royale, which is like a Japanese movie. It's almost the same premise, except it's more violent. And it's basically like kids go into an island and killing each other, and then the victor gets away. So it feels like saying that people have control over us, and then we just kind of like pawns in people's games, and yeah, that's what I got from it.
I thought it was interesting how it was almost cyclical. Like if you look back in terms of like gladiators, people would go to these stadiums and watch people kill each other, and then it kind of got to a point where that wasn't acceptable, and then we're at a point in this future world where it is acceptable again, and they're partaking in that. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
I basically thought what Anson thought, that it's super terrible and it's super brutal, and you can see the discrepancies between like living in shacks and going to the mines and like mining for the whole day compared to like the binging and the crazy technology they have in the cities.
For sure.
I only saw the trailer, but I thought it was pretty savage.
Yeah, it is pretty savage. And what I got out of it was a lot of the sort of wealth discrepancy, as the title of my paper suggested, in which a lot of everything that was in there is we have the discrepancy between the capital, in which there's so much wealth, there's so much technology that's there, and then we have the districts in which it's very primitive. And so the thing that reminded me most is pretty much this one video that should only take about a minute or two to watch. So pretty much what I mean by all this is that we're going at breakneck speed towards a singularity, and yet we have all these people that, as you can see in the video, their housing isn't exactly the greatest. And the irony in, let's say, the one little boy saying, I hate it when they give me pickles when I didn't ask for them. And the whole idea that whilst we're going and desiring more technology that can do more for us, we're leaving so many people behind, and that's what I'd like to focus for in this talk. So pretty much, we're playing the Hunger Games, not very deliberately, but yet it still is. So I'd just like to leave this quote up and bring up a few little things within it. This is Katniss as she's just getting to the Capitol and is being kind of surveyed over by Cena. And the whole idea that he just pressed a button, food came up, and she's thinking about, well, food just came up from pressing a button. Like, this is all the work I would have to go through to be able to go and produce this meal. And as it says, about midway through, right around here, that it would still be a poor substitution for the capital version. And pretty much what I'm trying to get out of this is saying that the Hunger Games trilogy, Pan-Am, is pretty much what we're doing currently within society, in which the capital is kind of where we're at right now, in which we have so much excess and everything, and yet there's places that do not have this. Another part of this quote is that there's commenting on, where is that? there is commenting about like decorating the body and sort of physical appearance alterations, which would be a surgical procedure in which that wouldn't be happening within the districts. And then on top of that, Sina's comment of how despicable we must seem to you. And in a way, I wonder if that's a comment that is very frequent to people moving to Canada or other developing countries. So the main problems I'd like to discuss right now before we get into solutions is the food and resource distribution issue, medical aid, and then the technological disparity. So to start off with the food and resource distribution, annually in Canada, we waste $27 billion worth of food. And yet we still have diseases that are obesity related, and then there's people in third world countries that are literally starving to death despite everything that's going on. And then on top of that, it's that whole idea of the tesserae. And I mentioned that there's distrust within there, because within the districts, we saw how with the tessera, and especially with the reaping, that the more one person went for a tessera, their name was put into for the reaping more times than it was cumulative. And in a way, that's often how we kind of feel about these food stamps that are going around, where we're sitting down thinking, well, we're giving all these food stamps to people just on the streets that aren't able to feed themselves, and yet we're kind of complaining about having to pay for it because we think that they're not doing enough or something like that, and it's very complicated situations. But then also the tesserae as kind of an allegory for how frequently an illness can be passed around throughout a system. So with Gale, he had his name put in 42 times for the reaping when he was 18 because of how many tesserae he had on top of everything else. Whereas Mage, the mayor's daughter, so there we have this division where her name was only put in 5 times. So that's kind of like with illness, where it's more common for the poor and poorer people to get these very preventable diseases, but yet the richer have a very low frequency within that. I also brought up slavery within this because a product of poverty is often slavery. And so in modern day society, how we see this is often, and this is brought up by David Batstone in his book, Not for Sale, in which a lot of parents will actually go and sell their child into slavery, more often than not with good intentions, thinking that their child will have enough food, will be able to get an education, and probably even have better job prospects than previously thought. And this is also brought up within the Hunger Games in different ways, where the capital, by means of reducing how much food is being distributed towards the districts, they're kind of forcing the hands of the populations and saying, well, you have to go work because if you don't work, you're not getting any food, whatever little amount they would actually be getting in the first place. Second off, with medical care, there is a big discrepancy in modern day society as well as within Pan Am. So within Pan Am, one sort of example that I would like to bring up is the difference between Katniss's treatment for when she goes deaf compared to Gale after he was whipped within Catching Fire, in which Katniss had this wonderful medical procedure in which she went from deaf in one ear to being able to hear again, versus Gale, they pretty much just put snow on his back and was like, well, we'll see how well this turns out, but we can't do anything further because we don't have the proper medical treatments. And that's often what's happening nowadays, where, let's say in third world countries, where there's not as many doctors that are present, or there's the medical centers are too far away and there might not be the ambulances or other resources in order to bring that person to a hospital in order for them to actually get proper treatment. However, there is Doctors Without Borders and the World Health Organization that do have different systems that they're bringing up to be able to reduce this incidence, which is very good. But at the same time, what we really need in those third world countries is actually to be able to go and train doctors from there with a direct knowledge of what diseases are present within that country. And of course, like we heard from Dr. Bibiana Kujek, in which she would go over to Nepal, was it 3 times, and help within a medical school to help set up a school there. On top of this, there's also the lack of medical technology present in many third world countries. And the problem with this is often, like again, we heard with Dr. Kujak, in which we can go and donate all of this technology, and it's all wonderful and great. Like now they can have an echocardiogram or an MRI. But the issue here is that often they're unable to then go, and if something breaks down, to fix it because they don't know either how it works, or they don't have the resources or the funding to be able to buy a new part for that. Another discrepancy seen in modern day society, and it's also in Pan Am, is the difference of the ability to receive medical attention because of costs. So in Pan Am, in the districts, they're all very poor and cannot actually purchase any of the medical treatments or go see an actual doctor. Instead, they'll go to an apothecary that might be using, it might be more like naturopathic medicine versus the medicine that we have now, and that's often the case in other countries too, in which they might not be able to afford our sort of Western style medications, but they can go and get the sort of natural ones. As well, the biggest discrepancy I'd like to talk about is actually the technological disparity. So within the Hunger Games trilogy, we see a lot more of the theme of war, a lot of also medical technologies. But the whole idea that it's kind of alluded to that within the Dark Days, so the initial rebellion that was set 74 years before the Hunger Games begins, there's that suggestion that if the rebels had had better technology or technology equal to the capital, that there might have been a more fair fight. And so I bring up proxy wars into this, and especially in the 1980s, where the Afghan nation was actually battling against the USSR in order to receive their freedom, and the US is actually supplying a lot of aid. And what pretty much the US was doing was helping to even out the playing field. Now this was also within Pan Am when we see District 13 all of a sudden appearing in Mockingjay, the 3rd book. So just a fair warning, there are spoilers. But with District 13, they had built up their own technologies because they had separated themselves off from the capital. And as a result, they had their own technologies already developed, but they kept continuing developing everything as well. And in a way, it could very well replicate Moore's law, maybe on a shorter time scale since this is futuristic. Interestingly, there's the technological singularity wasn't really evident within the novels, so we don't actually see that the technology has the superhuman intelligence. It is still probably around the same intelligence, just we're using it better. Also have Marxism brought up in here because in District 13, we see very much so the idea of this communism where everything is the exact same, everyone dresses the same, everyone gets the same amount of food unless you're doing something else. But furthermore, we also see the whole idea of the poor trying to overcome the rich and pretty much gain their freedom. And by this, what I mean is the districts are trying to fight against the capital to pretty much be able to better feed themselves, especially after they see the opulence of the capital. And we see this in modern society in some ways, in which people do want to better their situations, and so they might leave or leave their country for somewhere else, or actually rebel against their government. And one quote that I would like to bring up in Marx is the whole idea, so the bourgeoisie is the rich. And so the bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production. And we can include this into war, where, let's say in the US government, $496 billion are being directed towards their military versus only $42 billion towards international aid. So there's this constant wanting to be able to protect oneself from the enemy, in essence. And within that war, and we saw this within the nuclear arms race between the US and the USSR, in which if you had the bigger, better weapons, the more likely you were to be intimidating to the other side and probably win. So that's all I'd like to say about that. But then how can we change or affect any of this as an individual? How can we as university students go and change society in such a way that is more equilateral, or that the poor are actually being able to be fed, so that while they're being fed, we can also advance towards the singularity and continue our technological advancement. So the difficulty in finding just a singular solution is that it highly depends on a person's ideology. So if you're more thinking towards the ends of communism and Marxism, it might be that total equilateral sort of approach where everyone gets the exact same on a global scale. Conversely, you could go with the Smithsonian sort of invisible hand idea, in which then it's like, well, we'll just let the market do whatever it does, and then hopefully everyone winds out winning in the end. Now, for me, I'm coming from a more midline to socialist sort of perspective, so I'm going to bring those ideas more just from that end. So what I would say is redirecting funding for military development to international aid. And why I think that this is going to end up helping in some way, shape, or form is that the more funding the more we're helping people help themselves, the less likely they're actually going to rebel out against unfairness. And what I mean by this is that if they have the technology and the food that they're requiring without having a corrupt government, the more likely they are to be more complacent or at least happier with their livelihood. Now, I'm not saying that everyone has to be on the exact same page and everyone has to be able to have the same opportunities, but the thing I'm kind of battling about is the idea that there's this one lady that I was talking to at the beginning of March, in which she said she moved to Canada in order so that she could actually pay for food and help her family through education, where in the Philippines she was completely unable to do so. So in a way, if we're redirecting our funding for the military towards international aid, and especially within academia, is that we can help them build up their own technological advancement. And then by the time we all reach the singularity, where it's not just a few regions of the world that are reaching the singularity, but the world as a whole reaching it about the same time. Now, there is a big problem with going and redirecting military funding, is that people like to have national security. And we can definitely see this with the US after 9/11, in which between the year 2000 and 2011, there was an 89% increase towards military funding. And that's a huge increase. So I just said about $496 billion being directed towards the military versus being directed towards international aid. So then, can we take funding from elsewhere? So I have here, we can slow the technological development in favor of feeding the millions. Now, I'm not saying to completely stop technological development, because without that, that is part of our own economic system. The more we're putting money into technology, the more we'll actually get out of it in the end, and hopefully some technologies that are more expensive right now will come down in cost in order for everyone to be able to enjoy them. And what I'm really focusing here is that I would like to see more children be able to go to bed with a full stomach than for myself being able to have a phone that'll talk to me. So I have here act locally, think globally, in terms of there's some awesome programs that we have out nowadays. Just over the past few weeks, we've seen the UNICEF water tap project coming out, where if you leave your cell phone still for 10 minutes, and now I think it's actually an hour maybe, then one child will be able to get enough water for the day, because there's a huge sanitation issue that's going on where there's a lot of people, 2.7 billion people globally do not have proper sanitation, and that's a huge issue. If we're advancing towards the singularity and people aren't having proper sanitation. Another aspect of this is that if we're helping people in other countries advance towards the singularity and be able to feed themselves, then we're helping reduce the discrepancy between them and us at this moment. So right now, if we're going with Moore's law, we're advancing our technology so much faster than they are if they're not at the same time frame as us. So the more we're advancing, the further that discrepancy, whereas I'd like to see that discrepancy shrink substantially. So that is all I would like to say. And if there's any questions?
I have a question. So you talked a lot about redirecting funding from various sources. So I'm assuming you're saying that the solution for fixing this problem of this disparity is from government funding. Am I correct?
Government funding, yes.
Government
in
funding?
some aspects.
Yeah, so I just wanted to get your opinion on one issue. I mean, with government funding, there's a big dilemma. I mean, like, with the US system especially, one of their biggest revenue generators is from corporate taxes stuff. And of course, with the US, there's a lot of corporate lobbying. The corporate interests are trying to reduce their own taxes. And there's a lot of people in Congress who may be listening or taking donations from these corporations. So I'm just asking like, your opinion on the future of corporate involvement in government funding and how to use that to fix a disparity.
In some ways, like corporate funding can help, but in other ways it can also inhibit. Because in some aspects, if you constantly see just people or these corporations giving funding, but they might have stipulations on their funding, it's a little bit sticky, but when I was within the Think Locally, Act Globally, how we buy and sell things is also going to affect how corporations are buying and selling things. So let's say when I was in high school, I was on a social justice committee in which we actually had a very high focus on the modern global slave trade. And so we did a presentation on slavery and saying, well, we want to promote fair trade products, and in saying so, a lot more people actually ended up buying that. And as the years went by, going to shop at Safeway or everything, there was bigger and bigger and bigger sections of these fair trade products, and more of those products are being brought in. So in a way, that's redirecting in a good sense, using the corporations to actually help us, versus like if we're consistently buying, let's say from Nike, which is very well known for pretty much the sweatshops, the more we're buying from there, the more we're promoting that, and in a way, like going back to the sort of analogy within the Hunger Games, that the capital was able to better sort of squash resistance within the districts because the districts were not well fed, they didn't have very good technology, and there was just that huge discrepancy, and that's what we have now too. Yeah.
So we've been talking a little bit about the solutions that could be, that people can partake in, but how can, like, for the step before that, how can we provide the motivation for people, I guess, to change their ways? Because a lot of people feel terrible about what's happening in other parts of the world, but they would rather have their talking cell phone, and they would rather have those aspects to their life. So how can we get the push for this change in the first place?
That is the difficulty, and like I think in part what Suzanne Collins was kind of getting at when she was writing was to make us feel uncomfortable with that discrepancy. And in a way, it's a lot of our sort of influences are coming in from the media. So the more media is saying, well, what about this, the more we're going to listen to it. And in a way, like bringing up the UNICEF again, where it's, well, you could just leave your cell phone down for 10 minutes, maybe an hour, however long you want, and within that, I think it was the CEO of Armani was going to donate money towards water sanitation in these countries. So we have these sort of methods where we can use technology that we have in order to actually go and produce help within these third world countries, if that answers your question.
Wouldn't you say investing in, I guess, new technology, like new innovations, be a more efficient way than government funding to third world countries? I mean, if you invest in new technology, that would solve the problem. I mean, the problem would be solved if we reached singularity.
That is true, but at the same time, are we going to reach singularity where we're all going to be able to pretty much implant ourselves within a computer, let's say, and be able to just, if we die or something, we're able to get back or kind of have that check stop sort of idea. But yet there's people still starving in Africa. Like, for me, it's more the fairness of, should we have people at the singularity when others are completely not there, very, very far from it? That's where I'm more coming from, where, yeah, if we get to the singularity, the problem will probably solve itself, but at the same time, I'd like to see the singularity happening for everyone at the same time.
So how would you respond to people who are like cynical, who says this disparity is kind of like natural selection, which is random, right? And those people with wealth are just better off. They have better fitness, so that's why they have like the better money compared to people who are like poor. So like they're using evolutionary biology to say the discrepancy. So they don't really support of funding them to, like, let's say Africa or third world countries, right? So how would you try to counter that argument somehow?
In a way, to be able to go and, in going and saying a lot of, like, they were just born into it, it's their, like, they were just born into it, it's okay. That's kind of just letting things be, and in a way, I don't know how I would go and respond to that person without being like, well, you're crazy, like, what? Like, why wouldn't you want to go help this other person who's in much, much greater need? Why do you want to bring yourself up when there's somebody that obviously, like, doesn't have very much of anything? I'd find it probably very difficult to talk with them and kind of reason, but because there are 2 points to it, like, in a way that could work, just leaving things be. And there's actually one article that I read in Wall Street Journal in which the author was actually saying that international aid was probably giving more of a problem in Africa, and she focused there, than it was to just let things happen. And like, that's very true if you think of the corruption within governments, where that's one of the biggest issues in giving a lot of funding towards some governments is they're corrupt, they're going to take the money for themselves. But then you can kind of circumvent that by using non-governmental organizations to try to redirect the funding. But at the same time, it's more complicated. Yeah.
So I just wanted to talk about process a little bit here. Earl Waugh can't be here today and for the sessions on Thursday, but next Tuesday, the 8th, a week from today, he will be there, and the videos from the presentations today and on Thursday will be out. So I think we'll provide him some opportunity to ask you guys questions. It'll be, a few days later or a week after, but I think that will be good, because it's a little bit, disappointing to only have me and a few students here. So there's the opportunity that on the 8th we could have a lot more discussion of these same presentations. So saying that, we'll now go on to Ian, and he can set up. So thank you very much.